The stars looked different this far from Earth, but Marcus Webb had gotten used to that months ago. During his solo exploration mission through the outer territories of known space, his ship, the Wanderer, was small by military standards, but perfect for long-range reconnaissance work across uncharted systems. Where bigger vessels would attract too much attention, Marcus sat in the pilot's seat drinking recycled coffee that tasted like burnt metal and reviewing sensor data from the latest star system. When every alarm on his console started screaming at once, a massive vessel had dropped out of faster than light, traveled directly in front of him, blocking his path like a wall of dark metal and pulsing lights that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who saw them. Well, that's not friendly, Marcus muttered to himself as he killed the alarms and tried to change course. The alien ship was at least 50 times larger than the Wanderer and bristled with weapons that were already locking onto his position, according to his threat detection systems, before he could engage his own FTL drive. A tractor beam locked onto his hull with enough force to make the entire ship shudder and groan under the stress of sudden deceleration. Marcus gripped his armrests as his vessel was pulled toward a hangar bay that opened like a mouth in the side of the larger ship, swallowing the Wanderer whole before he could send more than an automated distress signal back toward Earth space. The hangar was massive and filled with smaller craft that looked like fighters or assault ships, all bearing the same dark color scheme and aggressive design philosophy as the mothership. Armed figures surrounded his vessel the moment it touched down, and Marcus could see through his view screen that they were tall, easily 7 feet high, with gray-scaled skin and eyes that glowed a faint orange color in the dim lighting. They wore armor that looked both ceremonial and functional, covered in symbols he didn't recognize but understood meant military rank and unit designation from years of working with soldiers from different Earth nations. A voice crackled through his communication system, speaking in heavily accented but understandable English that his ship's computer had probably transmitted during the capture. Human pilot, exit your vessel with hands visible, or we will extract you by force. Marcus considered his options for about 3 seconds before realizing he had exactly 0 good ones. So he powered down his weapons, stood up from the pilot's seat, and walked to the airlock. The aliens grabbed him the moment he stepped onto their deck, their 3-fingered hands surprisingly strong as they pulled his arms behind his back and attached restraints that hummed with some kind of energy. One of them stepped forward, clearly the leader based on the extra decorations on his armor and the way the others deferred to him with slight bows of their heads. "I am Commander Zethrak of the Kryn Confederacy," the alien announced. "In that same accented English, you have violated our territorial space." Marcus almost laughed because the star charts Earth had purchased from the Galactic Trade Network showed this system as unclaimed frontier space, but he kept his mouth shut and just nodded. Zethrak circled him slowly, studying him the way a scientist might examine an interesting specimen. And Marcus got the feeling this wasn't just about territorial violations. "Your species is new to this region," Zethrak continued. "We have heard rumors of humans, of Earth, but this is our first direct contact." "Lucky me," Marcus said dryly. One of the guards hit him in the stomach for that comment. Not hard enough to do real damage, but enough to make the point that talking back wasn't appreciated in Kryn culture. Zethrak held up a hand to stop any further violence and leaned closer to Marcus, with what might have been curiosity in those glowing orange eyes. "We will see how your species handles our standard processing procedures for unauthorized visitors," the commander said. "If you survive, perhaps we will discuss your release." That didn't sound promising at all. But Marcus had been in bad situations before. During his years as a search and rescue specialist in some of Earth's most dangerous regions, they dragged him through corridors that all looked the same, past other Kryn who stopped to stare at him with expressions he couldn't read on their alien faces. Eventually, they reached a cell that was just a transparent cube in the middle of a larger observation room, and they threw him inside before the walls sealed with a hiss of pressurizing air. Marcus stood up and dusted himself off, looking around at the Kryn who were gathering on the other side of the transparent walls like he was an exhibit at a zoo. Rax stood front and center with what looked like scientists or technicians flanking him on both sides. All of them watching Marcus with intense focus. Human, Zethrak called out through speakers in the ceiling. What you are about to experience is how the Kryn Confederacy has brought order to 17 species across 43 worlds. Marcus felt his stomach tighten because that sounded like the setup to something very unpleasant. But he kept his face neutral and his breathing steady. We have developed a weapon that breaks the will of any sentient being. The Commander continued with obvious pride in his voice once exposed. Prisoners become completely compliant and willing to provide any information we require without physical torture or lengthy interrogation. One of the technicians pressed something on a control panel, and Marcus heard a hissing sound from Vince in the ceiling of his transparent cell. A pale yellow gas began flooding into the space, and Marcus's training kicked in. Immediately, as he evaluated his options and found them severely limited, the gas had sharp chemical smell mixed with something organic and rotten, like tear gas combined with the scent of decay and old sweat. Marcus had been exposed to tear gas during training exercises years ago, and this reminded him of that, but with an extra edge that made his nose wrinkle in disgust. He could hold his breath, but that would only delay the inevitable and might make them think he knew something about countering their weapon. Better to just face whatever this was head on, like he'd faced everything else in his life, from burning buildings to avalanche zones. Marcus took a deep breath of the fear gas and immediately felt something trying to crawl into his brain through his sinuses and lungs. Kryn leaned forward as one, clearly expecting some kind of dramatic reaction based on their body language and the way their glowing eyes tracked his every movement. Marcus coughed once as the gas irritated his throat, then coughed again and wiped his eyes, which were watering slightly. From the chemical, Bernhay looked up at the assembled aliens who were watching him with what he was starting to recognize as confusion on their scaled faces. "That's it?" Marcus asked, his voice rough from coughing but steady. "Smells like my high school locker room mixed with tear gas." He took another breath, deeper this time, and shook his head in disappointment. "You guys got anything stronger?" The silence from the other side of the transparent wall was absolutely deafening as every Kryn in the room stared at him like he'd just done something physically impossibly. Thrak's orange eyes went wide and he turned to his technicians with what was clearly a demand for explanation based on his aggressive hand gestures. Marcus sat down cross-legged on the floor of his cell and waited to see what would happen next, because this was clearly not going according to the Kryn's plan. Commander Zethrak had conquered worlds with the fear gas and never once seen a reaction like this from any sentient species in the galaxy. The human sat calmly on the floor of the containment cell, breathing normally while surrounded by enough neurotoxin 7 to reduce a Vrin warrior to sobbing child or freeze a Korthan general in catatonic terror. Increase the concentration, Zethrak ordered his chief scientist, a female Kryn named Sella, who was already frantically checking her instruments and running diagnostics on the delivery system. "Commander, we are already at standard saturation levels," Sella protested. "The human should be experiencing complete psychological breakdown. Does he look broken to you?" Zethrak snapped, gesturing at Marcus, who was now examining his fingernails with apparent boredom. "Increase it to double concentration." Sella's eyes went wide because that level of exposure was considered dangerous even with full decontamination protocols in place. But she obeyed her commander and adjusted the gas mixture flowing into the cell. Marcus noticed the hissing sound getting louder and the yellow fog growing thicker around him until he could barely see the Kryn observers through the transparent walls. This time, when he breathed in the concentrated dose, something did happen inside his mind. Images started flashing behind his eyes, pulled from his deepest memories and worst experiences over his 42 years of life on Earth. He saw his teammate Sarah falling through broken ice during a mountain rescue operation, her hands slipping from his grip as freezing water pulled her down into darkness. He saw the building collapse in Jakarta, where he'd been too late to save the family trapped on the 3rd floor, arriving just in time to hear their screams cut off under tons of concrete and steel. He saw his daughter Emma lying in a hospital bed at age 7, so small and pale during her battle with leukemia that he'd been terrified every single day that she wouldn't Survive the Fear gas was designed to take these memories and amplify them, to make the victim experience them as if happening right now in an endless loop until their mind simply gave up and shut down. But Marcus had learned something during those years of facing death and failure and loss on an almost daily basis in his search and rescue work. He had learned that fear was just information, just his brain trying to keep him alive by making him pay attention to danger. He had learned breathing techniques from a meditation instructor after Emma's recovery, ways to acknowledge fear without letting it control his actions or paralyze his thinking. Marcus sat in the lotus position on the floor and focused on his breathing. In 4/4 counts and out 4/4 counts, while the images played through his mind like a horror movie, Sarah fell, but I got 6 other people off that mountain alive that day, he said out loud. Talking himself through the fear response, the Jakarta family died, but I saved 11 people from that same building before it came down. Emma survived, and she's 20 years old now, studying engineering at university. Each memory of failure got paired with a memory of success, each loss with a reminder of someone saved, each fear with evidence that he'd survived worse and kept going. The Kryn watched in complete bafflement as the human talked to himself in the gas cloud, his voice steady and calm despite being exposed to enough fear toxin to break an entire military unit. This is impossible, tss, Sela whispered, her instruments showing that the human's heart rate was actually decreasing instead of spiking. Into panic levels, his brain chemistry should be flooding with stress hormones right now. Zethrak's scales were flaring along his neck, and the display of agitation that his crew knew meant their commander was seriously disturbed by something. What kind of species is this? He muttered, more to himself than to anyone else in the observation room, after 30 minutes of exposure that should have left Marcus a drooling mess on the floor. They shut off the gas and activated the air filtration system to clear the A. Cell. Marcus stood up and stretched his legs, which had gotten stiff from sitting, then walked to the transparent wall and looked directly at Zethrak. With clear eyes and a slight smile. You want to know how I'm still standing? Marcus asked. It's because my species has spent the last 10,000 years developing tools specifically to cope with existential dread. The translation software took a moment to process the phrase existential dread, and when it finally appeared on Zethrak's display screen, the commander looked even more confused. We invented philosophy, Marcus continued, warming to his subject now that he had a captive audience. We invented religion and psychology and meditation and cognitive behavioral therapy. We created entire systems of thought dedicated to understanding and managing fear because we're a species that knows we're going to die from the moment we're old enough to understand language. He tapped the transparent wall between them for emphasis. Every human child eventually asks their parents why people have to die. And we have to explain mortality to beings who are barely old enough to tie their own shoes. You think your manufactured fear impresses a species that has to consciously choose to keep living every single day, despite knowing that everything we love will eventually be taken from us. The silence in the observation room was profound as the Kryn tried to process what they were. Hearing Sela was the first to speak, her voice uncertain in a way that Zethrak had never heard from his normally confident chief scientist commander. I think we may have made a serious miscalculation about this species. Marcus laughed, and the sound made several of the Kryn guards jump because they'd never heard a prisoner laugh while still in the containment cell. You based your whole military strategy on one weapon. Marcus said that's tactically unsound. What happens when you run into someone it doesn't work on? Zethrak's hand moved to the ceremonial blade at his side, an instinctive response to feeling threatened that he caught and controlled before any of his crew noticed. We have other methods of extracting information, Commander said coldly. I'm sure you do. Marcus agreed, but here's the thing about humans that you should probably know before this goes any further. He sat down cross-legged again, making himself comfortable like he was settling in for a long conversation. We're persistent hunters from a death world where almost everything is trying to kill us all the time. We evolved to keep going when we're tired, to keep fighting when we're injured, to keep thinking when we're terrified. Some of our ancestors used to chase prey animals for days across open plains under the hot sun. just following them relentlessly until the prey literally died from exhaustion. The Kryn were making small gestures to each other that Marcus recognized as signs of discomfort. Even across the species barrier, we climb mountains that kill us. We dive to ocean depths that crush us. We launch ourselves into space knowing we might never come home. Marcus said, "We do all of this voluntarily. For fun, for science, for the challenge of it. You picked the wrong species to try and scare into submission." Zethrak turned away from the cell and gestured for his senior staff to follow him into a private conference room, adjacent to the observation area through the transparent walls. Marcus could see them having what looked like a heated argument with lots of aggressive hand gestures and flaring of neck scales. Used the time to do some stretches and breathing exercises, keeping his body loose and his mind calm despite being a prisoner. On an alien warship, light years from any help. After about 20 minutes, the Kryn leadership returned to the observation room, and Zethrak's expression had shifted from confused to grimly determined. The Kryn High Council will want to see this for themselves, the commander announced. "You will be held here until our chief interrogator arrives. She has broken the will of planetary leaders and military commanders across a dozen systems." Marcus shrugged like this news didn't bother him at all. "Sure. I've got nowhere else to be," he said. "You got anything to eat, though? I'm starving, and your fear gas isn't very filling." The chief interrogator arrived 3 days later, and Marcus had spent that time eating surprisingly decent alien food, doing push-ups and sit-ups in his cell, and generally treating his captivity like an unexpected vacation. Her name was Krelenth, and she was older than the other Kryn Marcus had seen. With darker scales and scars that suggested a long career in violent work she studied, Marcus through the transparent walls for a full hour before saying anything. Just watching him do exercises and hum old songs to himself, Commander Zethrak says, "You are immune to our fear toxin." Her voice deeper and rougher than the male Kryn Marcus had dealt with so far. "I don't believe in immunity. Only insufficient dosage and improper application." Marcus finished his set of push-ups and stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "Nice to meet you too," he said cheerfully. "I'm Marcus, and you are?" Krelen's eyes narrowed at his casual tone, but she didn't rise to the bait. "I have brought the complete interrogation suite," she said instead. "By the time I am finished, you will beg to tell me everything about Earth's military capabilities, your ship's mission parameters, and your species' weaknesses." Bold claim. Marcus said, "Let's see if you can back it up." What followed was the most professionally brutal 3 days of Marcus's life. And he'd been through military survival training that included waterboarding and stress positions. Krelth started with an enhanced version of the fear gas, this time combined with auditory hallucinations that were supposed to make the victim hear the screams of everyone they'd ever failed to save. Marcus heard Sarah screaming from under the ice, heard the Jakarta family crying for help, heard his daughter calling for him in that weak hospital voice, but he also heard his instructor's voice from therapy sessions, teaching him how to ground himself in the present moment. "5 things I can see," Marcus said out loud, looking around the cell transparent walls. Yellow gas, monitoring equipment outside. Krelenth watching me, and a small crack in the floor tile for things I can touch, the floor under me. My clothes, my own hands, the wall when I reach for it. He continued through the grounding exercise while Krelenth watched with growing frustration visible in the way her scales were flaring along her spine when the fear gas failed again. She switched to pain inducers, devices that stimulated nerve endings to create the sensation of burning or cutting without actually damaging tissue. Marcus been injured enough times during rescue operations to have a pretty high pain tolerance, but this was beyond anything he'd experienced before. His entire body felt like it was on fire from the inside out, and he couldn't stop himself from crying out and gritting his teeth hard enough to make his jaw ache. But pain was just another form of information, another signal from his nervous system. Marcus had learned long ago to separate the sensation from the panic response. He started singing, his voice rough and broken by gasps, but still carrying the tune of an old military cadence from his early days in emergency services. "They say that in the army. The coffee's mighty fine. It looks like muddy water and tastes like turpentine." The Kryn guards outside the cell looked at each other in confusion because prisoners under pain. Induction usually screamed or begged or passed out from the overwhelming sensory. Input Grelanth increased the pain levels in Marcus's. Song turned into more of a pained chant, but he kept going. Kept focusing on the rhythm and the words instead of the fire in his nerves. They say that in the army. The biscuits are mighty fine. One rolled off the table and killed a friend of mine after 6 hours of continuous pain induction that should have broken anyone's will to resist. Grelanth finally shut off the device, and Marcus collapsed onto the floor of his cell, shaking and covered in sweat. But when she asked him for information about Earth's defenses, he just laughed weakly and said, "You're going to have to try harder than that." The sensory deprivation came next, and this was actually more difficult for Marcus than the pain had been. They moved him to a specialized chamber that blocked all light, all sound, all sensation, except the feeling of floating in a neutral temperature gel that matched his body heat. Exactly humans weren't. Meant for complete isolation, and Marcus knew from his psychology training that even a few hours in total sensory deprivation could cause hallucinations and mental breakdown. Lasted about 2 hours before he started seeing lights that weren't there and hearing voices that didn't exist. But instead of panicking, Marcus decided to treat it like a meditation retreat and started reciting poetry from memory to give his mind something to hold on to. Went through Robert Frost and Maya Angelou and even some Shakespeare that he'd memorized in high school. Speaking out loud, even though he couldn't hear his own voice in the soundproof. Gelthacrin, monitoring his brain activity, saw it light up with language processing and memory recall. Saw him fighting the isolation by engaging every cognitive function he could access after. 24 hours in the deprivation chamber, they pulled him out because Grelanth was worried he might actually damage himself. Though not from the isolation itself, but from the sheer mental effort of resisting it, Marcus emerged shaking and disoriented. His sense of time completely scrambled, but still coherent enough to ask if they had any coffee, because he really needed the caffeinecral. Tried psychological manipulation next, using information they'd pulled from his ship's databases to create simulations of his daughter being threatened or his former teammates blaming him for their deaths. Marcus watched the holographic Emma beg for her father's help and felt his heart breaking because even knowing it wasn't real, seeing her in distress triggered every protective instinct he had. But he'd also spent years in therapy after Jakarta, learning to separate emotional response from operational decision-making. Learning to feel his feelings without being controlled by them. "That's not my daughter," he said firmly. Looking away from the hologram, "My daughter is safe on Earth, and your cheap hologram doesn't change that fact." The psychological attacks continued. For 2 more days, with Grelanth trying every manipulation technique in the Kryn playbook. From fake rescue scenarios to simulated execution threats, nothing worked. And Marcus could see the interrogators' professional confidence starting to crack around the edges. The 6th day of intensive interrogation. Something unexpected happened during another fear gas session. Marcus had been exposed so many times now that he'd actually started to build up a tolerance to the chemical components. And this time, instead of fighting the fear memories, he just sat with them. Quietly, the images still came, but they felt distant now. Like watching a movie instead of experiencing reality. And Marcus found himself getting drowsy from the repetitive exposure. He actually fell asleep sitting cross-legged on the floor, his head nodding forward onto his chest while surrounded by enough fear toxin to terrify a Battalion. Grelanth stared at the sleeping human through the transparent wall, and something in her expression shifted from professional determination to what might have been fear. She turned off all the interrogation equipment and stood there in silence for a long time before finally speaking to Zethrak, who had come to observe. "Commander, I have broken warlords and dissidents and terrorist leaders across 17 systems," she said quietly. "I have never failed to extract information from a prisoner until now." Zethrak finished. For her, Grelanth's scales went flat. Against her body, and what Marcus had learned was a Kryn display of defeat or submission. This human's resistance is not technological or pharmaceutical, she said. It is something fundamental to his psychology. to how his species processes fear and pain everything we do to him. He has already done to himself voluntarily as part of his culture's approach to personal development. She looked at Marcus sleeping peacefully in the gas-filled chamber and shook her head slowly. We cannot break what has already been broken and rebuilt stronger. The Kryn High Council convened an emergency session aboard their flagship, a massive vessel that served as both military command center and seat of government for the entire Confederacy. Marcus was brought before them in restraints, flanked by guards, while Commander Zethrak and Chief Interrogator Krelenth stood to one side, looking like officers about to be court-martialed. The council chamber was circular with 9 raised seats arranged around the perimeter, each occupied by an elder Kryn, whose scales had faded to pale gray with age, and whose eyes held the cold calculation of beings who had ruled through fear for generations. Supreme, Counselor Thainrek sat in the highest seat, his ceremonial armor covered in honors from dozens of conquest campaigns. We have reviewed the recordings of this human's interrogation, Thainrek began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. What we have seen is disturbing, not for what it shows about our methods, but for what it reveals about this species. Marcus stood quietly and waited because he'd learned in the military that sometimes the best tactic was to let your opponents talk themselves into corners. You claim that humans are naturally resistant to fear-based psychological warfare, another counselor said. This one, a female named Sarakthi. Explain how this is possible when fear is a universal survival mechanism among all known sentient species. May I speak freely? Marcus asked. The Noric gestured permission with one clawed hand. Your fear gas works by triggering survival instincts and amplifying traumatic memories. Marcus began. The problem is that humans don't just experience fear. We analyze it, categorize it, and develop countermeasures for it. He shifted his weight to ease the pressure from the restraints on his wrists. Earth is what the galactic community calls a death world. Marcus continued. Our planet has extreme weather patterns that can kill in minutes, tectonic activity that destroys cities without warning, and a biosphere full of predators and parasites and diseases. Humans evolved in an environment where literally everything was trying to kill us all the time. The counselors leaned forward slightly, their attention focused entirely on the human prisoner, who was describing his homeworld like it was perfectly normal. We have hurricanes that can level entire coastal regions. Marcus said. We have earthquakes that split the ground open, volcanoes that bury cities in ash, tsunamis that drown thousands. We have predators that can bite through bone, insects that carry deadly diseases, plants that are poisonous to touch. That sounds like a nightmare world. Sarakthi said quietly. It's home. Marcus replied with a slight smile. And because we evolved there. We didn't develop fear as a stop signal. We developed fear as a go signal. He could see the confusion on the Kryn faces, so he elaborated. When a human feels fear, it means we've identified a threat that needs to be addressed. Marcus explained. Our adrenaline spikes. Our focus narrows and we move toward the danger. Instead of away from it, we run into burning buildings to save strangers. We climb mountains during storms to rescue injured hikers. We dive into freezing water to pull out drowning children. Every emergency responder, every soldier, every astronaut in human history is someone who learned to use fear as fuel instead of letting it be a brake. Thainrek's scales were flaring in agitation. Now, because everything the human was saying contradicted the fundamental assumptions that Kryn military doctrine was built upon. You're claiming that your entire species has weaponized its own fear response? The Supreme Counselor said. Not weaponized. Marcus corrected. Domesticated. We teach our children that bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite being afraid. We have sayings and stories and cultural traditions all built around the idea that the thing you fear most is exactly what you need to face. Another counselor spoke up. This one, an ancient male named Vriktar, whose scales were nearly white with age. If what you say is true, then humans should be a species of warriors, conquering everything in their path. Vriktar said. Yet our intelligence reports suggest Earth has only recently achieved faster than light travel and has no significant military presence in this region. Marcus nodded because this was a fair point. We spent most of our development fighting each other instead of uniting against external threats. He admitted, turns out when you have a whole planet full of persistence predators who treat fear as a challenge, you get a lot of internal conflict, but we've been getting better at cooperation, especially once we've realized we weren't alone in the universe. He looked directly at Thanrek. Your Confederacy has been expanding in this direction for the last 50 years, according to our intelligence. Marcus said you've conquered 17 species across 43 worlds using fear gas as your primary weapon. Earth has been watching and analyzing your tactics the entire time. The silence in the council chamber was absolute, as the implications of what Marcus was saying sank in. You're telling us that humanity has known about our fear weapon and has been preparing countermeasures? Sarakthi said slowly, we're telling you that your fear weapon won't work on us. Marcus confirmed every human who signs up for military service or emergency response or space exploration goes through psychological conditioning specifically, designed to build resilience against exactly this kind of attack. We've been running our own fear gas experiments for decades, trying to replicate your toxin from the reports we got from refugees fleeing your expansion. Why? Thanrek demanded, why would you expose your own people to psychological weapons? Because that's what humans do, Marcus said simply. We inoculate ourselves against diseases by exposing ourselves to weakened versions of viruses. We prepare for disasters by running drills and simulations. We face our fears by confronting them in controlled environments until they lose their power over us. He looked around at all 9 counselors. You built your entire empire on the assumption that fear is an absolute weapon, that all sentient beings will break when confronted with their deepest terrors. Marcus said you never considered that there might be a species that actively practices being afraid as a form of training. Krelenth spoke up for the first time since the hearing began. Her voice tired. The human is correct. She said to the council, I have used every technique in our arsenal, and his resistance is not technological. It is psychological. His species has developed a culture and training methodology that specifically counters our primary strategic advantage. Vrikdar turned to Zethrak, commander. What is your assessment of the military implications? Zethrak stood straighter and spoke in the clipped tones of a formal military briefing. If humans possess widespread immunity to our fear weapons, then our standard conquest protocol is useless against them. He said we would need to engage in conventional warfare, which we have not had to do for 3 generations. Our troops are trained for occupation and intimidation. It's not battlefield combat against a resistant enemy. Furthermore, Zethrak continued, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say, if humanity chose to share their psychological conditioning techniques with the species we currently occupy, it could trigger rebellion across the entire Confederacy. Marcus saw his opening and took it. My ship has been transmitting everything that's happened here back to Earth on a delayed signal. He said, by now, my government knows I was captured, knows about your fear gas, and knows that it doesn't work on humans. The counselors all started talking at once in their own language, a rapid-fire exchange that Marcus's translator couldn't keep up with. Finally, Thanrek raised his hand for silence and the chamber went quiet again. What does Earth want? Supreme Counselor asked, and Marcus could hear the defeat in his voice. Marcus took a deep breath because what he said next would determine whether this ended in diplomacy or in the bloodiest war the galaxy had seen in generations. Earth wants peace, he said simply, but not the peace you've been enforcing with fear. In chemical weapons, Thanrak's eyes narrowed. Explain. The species you've conquered with your fear gas didn't submit because they respected you or because they believed in your government. Marcus said they submitted because you broke their will to resist. That's not peace. It's just temporary control maintained through ongoing psychological torture. He looked at each counselor in turn. What happens when word gets out that your fear weapon failed against humans? Marcus asked, what happens when your subject species realize that the thing they thought was invincible can be resisted with proper training? Sarakthi made a gesture that Marcus had learned meant distress or anxiety among the Kryn. Our empire would collapse. She said quietly, rebellions would ignite across every occupied world. We would face uprisings from 17 species simultaneously. Exactly. Marcus agreed. Your entire power structure is built on a psychological trick that only works as long as everyone believes it's unbeatable. Now, you've got humans flying around telling everyone that the Emperor has no clothes. The translation software struggled with that idiom, but seemed to get the general meaning. Crossrector leaned back in, his seat and studied Marcus with ancient eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall. So humanity plans to destroy the Confederacy by revealing our weakness. The old counselor said, that is a weapon far more dangerous than any fleet of warships it could be. Marcus admitted, or it could be an opportunity. Thanerek's scales flared in irritation. An opportunity for what? Human? An opportunity to build something better? Marcus said, look, I've read the intelligence reports on your expansion. The Confederacy provides stability and infrastructure to the worlds you conquer. You eliminate piracy. Establish trade networks. Share technology. You're not monsters. You're just using the wrong methods to achieve, actually. Decent goals. This seemed to surprise the counselors who had probably expected threats or demands rather than a nuanced analysis of their governing philosophy. What would you have us do? Thanerek asked. Dismantle our military?
Asked.
Surrender our sovereignty to Earth?
Either.
Marcus said. Earth doesn't want to rule your territory, and we definitely don't want to fight a multi-front war across 43 worlds. What we want is for you to transition from fear-based control to consent-based governance. The counselors looked at each other in confusion because this was apparently not a concept they were familiar with. Marcus continued. Release your subject species from occupation and offer them voluntary membership in a reformed confederacy. He explained, share your technology and infrastructure in exchange for trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. Give them a choice instead of just breaking their will. Why would they choose to join us after what we have done to them? Sarathi asked. Because the alternative is chaos. Marcus said, you've been providing stability and economic development for decades if you pull out completely. There will be power vacuums and fighting, but if you offer partnership instead of domination, at least some of them will probably. Take it. Zethrak spoke up from his position beside the council seats. And if they refuse? If they choose independence? Marcus shrugged. Then you let them go and prove that the Confederacy can respect autonomy that builds more credibility than 1,000 fear gas deployments ever could. Vriektar made a sound that might have been a laugh. You want us to build an empire on trust and mutual benefit instead of on fear? The old counselor said. That is a radical proposal from a species we have never even met before today. My species spent thousands of years building empires on fear and conquest. Marcus countered. We learned the hard way that those kinds of empires always collapse eventually. Better to learn from our mistakes than to repeat them. Thanerek stood up from his seat, his full height and ceremonial armor making him an imposing figure even by Kryn standards. And what role does Earth expect to play in this reformed confederacy? The Supreme Counselor asked suspiciously. Advisor, overlord, military enforcer, neighbor? Marcus said we want a stable border region and trading partners, not subjects or vassals. Earth has enough problems managing our own planet without trying to run yours too. The Supreme Counselor paced along the raised platform that held his seat, clearly thinking through the implications and options. You said your ship has been transmitting all of this back to Earth. Thanerek said, how long before your fleet arrives? We're already here. Marcus admitted, dropped out of FTL about 6 hours ago and have been waiting at the edge of this system for my signal. Every Kryn in the room went rigid in hands. Moved to weapons. But Marcus held up his bound hands in a placating gesture. They're not here to fight unless you make them. He said quickly, Earth sent a diplomatic flotilla. It's not a battle fleet. We want to talk first and shoot only if talking fails. Thanerek turned to one of the junior counselors. Verify his claim. The younger Kryn consulted a data pad and his scales went pale. Supreme Counselor. Sensors are detecting 17 ships of unknown configuration holding position at the system's outer boundary. He reported they match the energy signatures from the humans' vessel's 17 ships against our entire fleet. Sarathi said they must be very confident in their capabilities, or they're betting that you're smart enough to recognize when the game has changed. Marcus said. Thanerek was silent for a long time, his orange eyes fixed on the human prisoner who had somehow turned a routine interrogation into a potential revolution in galactic politics if we agree to these terms. To this reformation of the Confederacy, the Supreme Counselor finally said, what guarantees can Earth provide that you will not spread our weaknesses to our enemies? The same guarantee you can provide us. Marcus replied, mutual interest in stability if the Confederacy collapses into chaos. It creates problems for everyone in this region, including Earth. But if you transition peacefully to a voluntary alliance, then both our governments benefit from having a stable, prosperous neighbor. Vrikdar spoke up again. You are asking us to abandon the tactics that built our civilization and trust in a completely untested approach to governance. The ancient counselor said, that is not a small thing, I know. Marcus said quietly. But the alternative is watching your empire burn when the truth gets out about your fear weapon's limitations. At least this way you get to control the narrative and maybe salvage something from the transition. The counselors conferred among themselves in low voices for several minutes while Marcus stood waiting and trying not to think about how badly this could still go wrong. Finally, Thanrek turned back. To face him, we will agree to preliminary talks with Earth's diplomatic mission, the Supreme Counselor said. But understand that we are doing this under protest and with significant reservations about the wisdom of abandoning proven methods. That's all we're asking for, Marcus said, a chance to talk before anyone starts. Shooting Thanrek gestured, and the guards removed Marcus's restraints. A symbolic gesture that wasn't lost on anyone in the chamber. You will serve as the initial liaison between Earth and the Confederacy. The Supreme Counselor said, since you seem to understand both sides of this situation. Marcus rubbed his wrists. Where the restraints had left marks and nodded, I can do that. He agreed, though I should warn you that I'm much better at search and rescue than diplomacy. You have successfully negotiated the survival of both our civilizations in the last 10 minutes. Serexi pointed out, I think you will manage as guards escorted Marcus toward the docking bay, where an Earth shuttle was waiting to pick him up. Zethrak fell into step beside him. Human, the commander said quietly. Yes. Marcus replied, what you said about fear being a teacher rather than a weapon. Zethrak said, is that truly how all humans think? Marcus considered the question, not all of us? He admitted plenty of humans run from their fears or let fear control them. But our culture celebrates the ones who face their fears and overcome them. We tell stories about them, make them heroes. We teach our children to be like them. He looked at the Kryn commander. Maybe that's something your culture could learn. Marcus suggested how to honor courage instead of just inflicting fear. Zethrak was quiet for a moment, perhaps. The commander said, though it will be a difficult transition for a society built on different principles. The worthwhile changes are difficult. Marcus said that's what makes them worth doing as Marcus boarded the Earth shuttle and looked back at the Kryn flagship. He couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of the situation had been captured, tortured, and interrogated by an alien empire, and somehow ended up as humanity's first official ambassador to a civilization that was about to undergo a fundamental transformation. You wanted to know what humans fear? Marcus had told Zethrak in their final conversation, we fear becoming like you used to be, using terror instead of earning respect.